Hello and welcome. My name is Paulette Nessum, and I'm a member of the Board of Directors of Holocaust Museum LA and the daughter of Holocaust survivors. Thank you for joining us for our Building Bridges series, which brings together leaders from diverse communities for important conversations about working toward common social justice goals. Our work is more critical than ever, given the fragile state of today's world, with the war in Ukraine, humanitarian and refugee crises, and the alarming rise in hate crimes and rhetoric, especially targeting Black, Asian American, Pacific Islander, Latinx, Jewish, and other diverse communities. The Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at Cal State San Bernardino found that Los Angeles recorded the most hate crimes of any US city this century in 2021 alone. A few weeks ago, the California Department of Justice's annual report revealed hate crimes against Latinos saw a 30% increase in 2021, and anti-Jewish hate crimes rose 32%. We must take action, and education is our greatest catalyst for change. Holocaust Museum LA's mission is grounded in teaching students and visitors the critical lessons of the Holocaust and its continued social relevance, empowering them to speak out and stand up against hatred and bigotry in all its insidious forms. We strive to build a culture rooted in kindness, empathy, and treating people with respect. Fortunately, Jewish and Latinx communities are not just bound by firsthand experiences of prejudice and discrimination. As communities that share diverse immigrant backgrounds with strong ties to ancestral or native homelands, culture, history, and community are common threads. We are also united by the shared values of social justice. We're pleased to welcome community leaders for what I'm sure will be a productive discussion on how our communities can foster stronger ties, work together to combat hate, and build more accepting spaces. Joining us today are Antonio Villaraigosa, who served as the 41st mayor of Los Angeles from 2005 to 2013. Before becoming mayor, he served for 6 years in the California State Assembly. Since leaving public office, he's continued to be actively engaged in and speaks frequently on issues including education, civic engagement, immigration, and economic development. Mary Kohav is vice president of JEDI, which is short for Justice, Equity, Diversion, and Inclusion, and community engagement programs at the Jewish Federation of Greater Los Angeles. Mary has extensive experience working in diverse Los Angeles communities and leading DEI strategy and leadership programs for organizations in the private, public, and nonprofit sector in Southern California for more than 25 years. Rosie Arroyo is board chair of Hispanas Organized for Political Equality, or HOPE, whose mission is to build the Latina leadership pipeline and champion policies that advance Latinas in California and nationally. Rosie also serves as the Senior Program Officer for Immigration at the California Community Foundation. For almost 2 decades, she has dedicated her career to the educational and civic empowerment of underserved communities. And lastly, someone who I've known for a long time, Susan Schmidt is a Mexican Jewish chef who co-authored with her daughter Alex the Mexican Jewish Cookbook. You can also find their stories and recipes on their blog, Jalapeno. Holocaust Museum LA is the first survivor-founded and oldest Holocaust museum in the country and home to the West Coast's largest collection of Holocaust-era artifacts. Admission is free for all students and California residents. We bring you programs like this Building Bridges webinar at no charge. If you are enjoying our programs, we ask that you consider supporting our work by making a donation to the museum at holocaustmuseumla.org. It is now my pleasure to introduce the moderator of today's program, Museum Board Member Dan Schnur. Dan is a professor at USC's Annenberg School of Communications, UC Berkeley's Institute of Governmental Studies, and Pepperdine's School of Public Policy. He currently presents a monthly webinar called Dan Schnur Political Report for the LA World Affairs Council Town Hall. As one of California's leading political strategists, Dan has worked on 4 presidential and 3 gubernatorial campaigns. He served as the National Director of Communications for the 2000 presidential campaign of US Senator John McCain, and was the chief media spokesman for California Governor Pete Wilson. Dan, thank you for helping us create the Building Bridges series and for serving as moderator today.
Well, thank you, Paulette. Thanks for not just for being here with us today, but for all the work you do for the museum. Thanks as well to our panel. When Paulette was introducing me, I realized that my time in Sacramento that she mentioned is when I first got to know then Assembly Speaker Antonio Villaraigosa. And we're both a bit older, and one of us is much grayer than we were back in those days. But Mr. Mayor, it's great to have you with us today. And Rosie Arroyo, it's so terrific, as always, to have you here with us as a representative of hope. And for Mary and Susan, we're just thrilled to have you with us for the first time and hope it won't be the last. Paulette, as you mentioned, I think we're going to have a really exciting conversation today. For those of you who may not have joined us in the past, our Building Bridges program has been a monthly series for just over 2 years now. And every month, under the auspices, under the leadership of the Holocaust Museum and our CEO, Beth Keane, and our chair, Guy Lipa, we've talked about building and strengthening relationships, both between the Jewish community and other communities and within the Jewish community. And today we're going to be talking, as Paulette mentioned, about the relationship, past, present, and future, between two of the most vibrant and relevant and impactful communities here in the greater Los Angeles area, the Jewish and Latino communities. And I'm really excited to ask each of our panelists to weigh in with their thoughts. But Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa, I'm going to start with you with the broadest question to get our conversation going. From your perspective, given all the work you've done, not just in elective office, but at the community and neighborhood level throughout your career, why is this relationship? Why is the relationship between the Jewish and Latino communities so important to the Southland?
Well, first of all, thank you to the Holocaust Museum for sponsoring this monthly conversation, if you will, or panel. And Paulette, Dan, thank you for inviting me. And Rosie, Mary, and Susan, it's an honor to be here with you all. You know, why is the relationship so important? As I said to you yesterday, I think it's important for these two communities to have a relationship, but I think it's important for the entire city to come together. And I think there's no community like the Jewish community that's done the kind of outreach, not just here at the Holocaust Museum, but Museum of Tolerance, at so many different ADL, Federation, and the list goes on, of organizations that have worked to bring Jews and Latinos, Jews and African Americans together. And I think it's important. 70% of LA comes from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. We live in a city that's the third richest metropolitan economy in the world, behind Tokyo and New York, yet has the highest effective poverty rate of any big city in the country. It's a city that in many ways is the tale of 2 and 3 cities, if you will. A great deal of poverty and a great deal of wealth juxtaposed, living side by side. And I think it's important because at a time in America when so many people are so divided, when we've seen the rise in hate crimes across every group, not just the Jewish community, as I mentioned, Latinos, African Americans, gays, transgender, Jews, all across the board, we're seeing a level of hate that we haven't seen in a long time. So I think this is an important conversation to have. You mentioned the commonalities. I grew up in Bow Heights. It was the Ellis Island of LA. Back then, it was a large Jewish community, a large Latino community, and the Japanese American community, and they interacted. They actually lived side by side and worked and lived together and played together, if you will. And I think we need to return to those days. And from my vantage point, this effort to create stronger bonds, to improve the quality of our conversation, and importantly, to work together on common challenges facing our city, I think is, one of the most important things we could do right now.
Well, thank you, Mayor Villaraigosa. I have probably about 50 or 60 follow-up questions for you, but before I get to them, I really do want to make sure to include the rest of our panelists first. And so I'm going to turn to Rosie Arroyo now. And Rosie, before I ask you a question, I have to, for those of our audience members who have not been participants before, take a moment to offer a special thanks to you and to your colleagues at HOPE, at Hispanas Organized for Political Equality, because Rosie, you as the chair of the organization, and Helen Torres, the executive director, were really the driving force originally in putting together the conversations between the Latino, the Asian Pacific, the African American and Jewish communities about having these kind of conversations. So we're very, very grateful to you. So thank you to you and to all your colleagues at HOPE for playing such an instrumental role in making these programs happen. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan. It's an honor and a great pleasure. And also just wanted to thank you, the Holocaust Museum, for this invitation and be among this distinguished panelists and have this conversation. It's a very important conversation in time, and for HOPE, having the opportunity to cooperate and collaborate in this multi-ethnic coalition has been a strong vehicle to help advance more intentional conversations about opportunities to continue to build alliances across our communities and see how we can work together to address some of the challenges that our communities are facing.
So I'm going to ask you to essentially pick up where the mayor left off. He offered, I think he'd agree, a very, very helpful, broader overview of the relationship between these communities. But you used a phrase just a moment ago. You said that we're in an important time now. So what Antonio Villaraigosa has reminded us is this relationship has always been an important one and always will be an important one. But I know from our conversations, Rosie, you feel there's a particular urgency in this moment. So I'm wondering if you can talk about why this relationship that the mayor has just outlined for us is of such particular importance to us right now.
Yeah, no, thank you, Dan. I think it's a really important question and topic. And what I can share is that, as we've all seen the impact of this pandemic and how it really exacerbated a lot of the systemic barriers and challenges that our communities have been facing, particularly our communities of color, and seeing how it really just highlighted the economic disparities that exist in our communities. And so, with this moment in time, there's been a lot of dialogue. And as we're seeing historic investments also coming into our region, state, LA, California is at a turning point. This is a turning point moment for our region and state in terms of looking at opportunities as we look towards the future at how we advance economic recovery efforts. We have all witnessed how important it is to work across our communities because the pandemic did not discriminate. We were all impacted, and as we saw, majority of for those that were not able to have access to healthcare, quality healthcare, and other important critical resources, the well-being of our communities is really the well-being of all of our communities. And so I think this is a moment in time where there is much more awareness and recognition that we need to work towards more inclusive strategies and efforts that really help to broaden the narrative around how we can work together to move forward in a stronger and united way.
Thank you so much, Rosie. And I have quite a few more questions for you too, but if you'll excuse me for a minute, I want to make sure that Mary and Susan have a chance to weigh in first. I'm going to come to Mary. I'm going to come to Mary next. Because Mary, you and your colleagues at the Federation have devoted, at the Jewish Federation, have devoted so much time and effort to this kind of outreach. And for those of us in our audience and elsewhere who are responding to the urgency that Rosie was just talking about, it seems like such an immense task. Oh my gosh, I don't know how to boil the ocean. Forming these relationships, strengthening them, that's just a huge undertaking. as someone who does this every day, maybe you can give us some guidance on this. Where do we start? What should our first steps be toward getting to the point that Antonio and Rosie have been talking about?
Thank you for having me here. And I'm so honored to be among this really distinguished panel and to be a part of this conversation. So one thing that I think is really important here is to continue to do what the topic of this conversation is, to build bridges, to build alliances. And these kinds of alliances don't happen overnight. They take time to build, sometimes many years. So I would say as individuals, we should start with curiosity about learning about one another's cultures and communities. So for example, the Jewish community in Los Angeles is much more diverse ethnically, socioeconomically, and religiously than you might think. We just completed a demographic study of Jewish LA, and the findings will be vital to shaping how we move forward as a community. For example, 4% or about 22,000 Jewish individuals in LA identify as Persian or Iranian American, as I do. My parents immigrated to Michigan before I was born. But more relevant here is that 5% of LA Jews identify as Latino or Latina, so around 28,000. And also 14% of LA Jews identify as Sephardic, which means they have origins in Spain or are descendants of Spanish exiles. So as individuals, we really have a responsibility to get to know one another intentionally. That means reach out to a coworker who's different from you and get together for coffee. Really start to connect on a deeper level. And then I'll just say that organizationally, we need to continue to educate and convene our communities more. We've started internally with the Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion curriculum aimed at teaching how our Jewish values show us how to achieve a more equitable society. And through some of our community engagement work, we've done a lot of intercommunity partnerships and bridge building, where we partner with nonprofits outside of the Jewish community that work to combat systemic racism and inequities in their own communities. So I think we can lean in individually, again, to just really authentically get to know one another a little bit better and how we can be there for one another and to commit really in the long term to fostering those relationships. So thank you for that.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mary. I think that's a really good first step on guidance for the rest of us. And we'll be looking forward to hearing additional guidance from you as we go through tonight's program. For those of you who did not notice it, the amazing Jordana Gessler from the Holocaust Museum has posted a link to the study that the Federation has put out that Mary was just talking about, as well as a link to the homepage of the Holocaust Museum of Los Angeles. And we hope you'll take some time at the conclusion of this program to look at both of them. But one thing that Mary mentioned is she said there are 28,000, I think this is astounding, there are 28,000 Angelenos who are of both Jewish and Latina heritage, who have roots in both communities. And we're very, very fortunate to have one of those individuals with us tonight. And Susan Schmidt, I have to tell you, I can't tell you how excited I am that you're joining us tonight, not just because of the perspective you bring from that combined heritage, but also the way you've chosen to address these challenges of building bridges. And I'm really looking forward to talking to you about them. Before we get into the details though, I'm hoping because your path is such a unique one, I'm wondering if you could take a moment as someone with such deep roots in both communities to tell us a little bit about your heritage and your path forward.
Okay, hi everybody. I was born and raised in Mexico City to a Jewish family. And my father was born in New York and my mother was born in Hungary. And they met in Mexico City and got married. And I was born there. And when I was 11 years old, so I grew up speaking Spanish and English right away. We were pretty assimilated. So, you know, I was part of the Mexican culture. I was part of the Jewish culture. I just knew that we were Jewish. I didn't know that much about being Jewish, but I knew that I was. Then we came to this country and, you know, I'm 11 years old and listening to Mexican trio music and crying because I left my country and because I left my Hungarian grandma, who I used to stand on the chair watching make goulash and chicken paprikas, you know, and I was a 7-year-old little girl watching her make all these dishes in a city that, well, all we had was, no, not all we had, but we worshiped tortillas and beans and chiles and cilantro. And it was a very diverse kind of upbringing. And coming here was not easy. It was not easy. But, you know, little by little, and then I met my husband eventually after a long time, and he's also a Mexican Jew. And we just have so much in common and are able to share this magnificent diversity of cultures, the Mexican slang, the Mexican music, the Mexican food, along with the challah on Shabbat and the pozole on Shabbat with a matzo ball. It's just a convergence of the cultures.
Okay. Well, at some point, Susan, we'll have to compare notes because I have a Hungarian grandmother who had some pretty strong feelings about things. So we'll have to do a separate program on that. But coming back to the topic for today's program, I want to come back to Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa, because Mayor Villaraigosa, what you spoke about, and others have as well, is the commonalities between the two communities, but there are also significant differences as well. And I'm wondering if you'd be able to help us think through how we can address those differences and to build bridges to overcome them. Because one of the biggest challenges we face in today's society, not just in Los Angeles, but across the country and around the world, is we tend to define people by how we're different than them, as opposed to how we're similar. You've spent an entire career as a bridge builder. How do we address the divisions, the differences between the Jewish and Latino communities, so we can move forward together? Oh, Mr. Mayor, I think they've got you on mute. Oh.
I read your chat and you said to put it on mute, and I had forgotten.
There you go.
Yeah, I, you know, as I said earlier, I think this city needs to come together. You're right. I have worked my entire life along those issues, and not just with the Jewish community, but with the African American community, with the Asian American community. You know, when it was mentioned a few minutes ago about the study, if you'd have told me that there were more Latino Jews here than Persian Jews, I probably would have said no. Now, because I have such a strong relationship in the Jewish community, I knew that there were a lot, but I didn't know there were that much more. And that number is rather impressive. One of the things I think we can do, what are the differences? They're mainly, look, I believe human beings are human beings, and there's not a whole lot of difference between any of us. But where there are, there's socioeconomic differences. Now, it was mentioned that Jewish community isn't monolithic. Not everybody is, well-to-do, but it's certainly overall per capita a more well-to-do community than the Latino community might be. And one of the things I would suggest is, sitting on keyboards that, help organizations that are, directly helping people in the Latino community. I think that's important. When you look at, like so many of us, when you look at organizations that work in a specific community, they're usually monolithic. If it's an African-American organization, it's almost all African-American. If it's a Jewish organization, the same thing. If it's Latino, the same thing. And I think cross-fertilizing and really providing, support, both economic and otherwise, I think is one way that we could be working more closely together. I had mentioned to you yesterday that I think education is the biggest challenge that we're facing in this town. When you look at, and it's why I got involved in education, even though a lot of the pundits said, you got a lot of other things to do, why would you do it? And I mentioned yesterday, and I'll say it again today, and that is that I said, I saw, thousands of people excited about my candidacy and when I won, and most of them were serving me. and most of them looked like me. And, 13%, when I became mayor, 1 out of 3 schools were failing. We had a 44% graduation rate. It's now 72. I'm sorry, by the time I left, it was 72. It's now 85. But, only 13% of Latinos are actually going to a 4-year college and graduating from a 4-year college. And I think to the extent that we could get more involved in a community that's 50% of this town, about 80% of the school district, it's critical. I tell people we should be for that, no matter what group we're for, because they're going to be a big part of the majority of this town very, very soon. And if we don't make those kind of investments, I think we'll miss an opportunity. But frankly, I told you yesterday, I wanted to participate because the Jewish community is the community that's been the most active at reaching out. There is no community that reaches out to other groups as much as this one does. And I think that's important. But I'd like to see, and not just these opportunities for us to have a conversation about how we build bridges, but actually working, getting involved. I mentioned sitting on boards, but doing everything we can around the issue of education as an example. Because if we don't, I think when you look at the divisions in our country, disproportionately, they're less educated people. Not always. They're very intelligent people that, in fact, I was at the Museum of Tolerance 3 days ago, and I was looking at an exhibit where, Nazis with a doctorate were proposing the final solution. So that's not universal, but historically, most of the ignorance and the hate that we see are among the less educated. And I think we need to do a better job at educating people, not just around the issues of coming together, but around the commonalities we all have. I mean, there's very little, I'm listening to all of you, and there's very little difference between you and me. Yet when I ran for mayor, the newspaper of record called me a Latino candidate for mayor, even though I was born here. My mother was born here. My grandpa got here more than 100 years ago, frankly, probably more before most of you on this panel. I dismissed that, and pressured the Times. So by the end of the campaign, they stopped calling me that. But I said, what you're saying to everybody is I'm different. And I'm not any different. I was born and raised here. I'm as concerned as you are about the challenges that we face. And I think we need to do more of that. And again, I acknowledge that the Jewish community does that more than anybody else. And the Holocaust Museum is obviously committed to that with these monthly seminars or conversations.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Mayor Villaraigosa. And I think you're exactly right. The importance of education, the importance of awareness, but I thought your practical advice was very, very helpful too, because for someone who wants to get involved, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. For those of you who are members of the Jewish community, Mary and her colleagues at the Federation would love to involve you in their work. For those of you who are members of the Latino community, Rosie and her team at Hope would be excited to get you involved. I'm going to ask Jordana, if you can, Jordana, to maybe post the home websites for the Jewish Federation and for Hope. And then for those of you who are parts of other communities, let us know. And we'll put you in touch with an organization. So as the mayor mentioned, there's ways for you to get involved in efforts that are already underway. Now, this can be done organizationally. As Mary's going to talk about in a couple minutes, this can be done politically. But Susan, one of the things that's really struck me about the work you do is, in addition to the organizations and the politics, how much of this is personal, individual to individual. And I think we've still got you on mute too. So let's get that fixed. Well, but can you tell us about how you've tried to build these bridges on a human person-to-person level?
Sure, I wrote a few notes. So over the last few years, as I've witnessed how our local communities and our society in general have become more and more angry and divided, I thought, what could possibly bring us back from this all-permeating and profound and exhausting division? What could bring us a little more together? What could I, as one little individual among millions, do to bring us back from the abyss of endless political bickering? We desperately needed some levity. I concluded that it really came down to two things, food and music. I thought, who doesn't love guacamole? Who doesn't love tacos? Who doesn't love challah and delicious and comforting chicken soup and matzo balls? My being represents the convergence of all of these. I am a Mexican Jew. I have a profound love for Mexico and its people. I have a profound love for Israel and its people. And I have a boundless and intractable love for my country, the United States of America. Also, who doesn't love good music to listen to be touched and moved by? Being born and growing up in Mexico City, I had the privilege of experiencing various cultures, thereby gaining an appreciation for the nuances that make each culture extraordinary. I believe we can build bridges between communities through the education of young people. Let's teach each other who we are, thereby removing the mysterious mystique of the other. We can have classes in making tacos and challah, guacamole and chicken soup. And we can experience different music together. For instance, Yiddish klezmer music, Mexican trio music, and the American songbook. We can teach each other to grow by understanding the good embodied within the human beings in each of these cultures. In establishing my Instagram Kosher Mexican, I strove and strive to bring us a little more together each day, for we have more in common than we think.
So Mary, you've set the bar a little bit higher for me than you think you did. I have no musical skill, but I can clap, and I can't cook, but I can eat.
You called me Mary?
So count me in on both. Mary, I want to come back to you now because you did such a great job a few minutes ago of helping us think through those first steps forward. But as we take those steps forward, Mayor Villaraigosa talked about getting involved with an organization doing this kind of work, and the Federation is so good at this. From your vantage point at the Jewish Federation, what else can we be doing as a community to build the kind of bridges that Antonio and Susan are talking about for those of us who can't cook or sing?
No, I mean, I think we're at that time society where people are really thinking about how can they make a difference in their lives? How can they find purpose? How can they bring their efforts to a place where they really feel it matters? So I'll say, in terms of what we can be doing as a Jewish community to build bridges, I think we really need to commit to embrace principles of equity and inclusion, and we need to support public policy and legislation that's important to one another. So just for example, data shows that Jews and Latinos are ideologically diverse groups that tend to lean liberal. So let's get beyond the numbers and truly exercise our civic muscles as community members. Let's lean in and where it counts around voter rights, combating hate, addressing the real needs of our fellow Angelinos experiencing homelessness, helping our teens and other community members struggling financially or with mental health challenges. I think, rolling up our sleeves, it's something that kind of gets us back to the basics. I remember when I was in graduate school at UCLA studying public policy, I was the teaching assistant for Governor Michael Dukakis, and I asked him, what's one piece of advice about what I can do to make a difference? And he said, Mary, I like doing his voice. He said, Mary, get involved in a political campaign. It will change your life. And so a few years later, both through work and volunteering, I was involved on Mayor Villaraigosa's campaign, and that led to other campaign experiences. I was active on the Stem Cell Research and Cures Initiative. And through those experiences, I really got to know the rich fabric of LA, and just getting active with others who had my passion and were like-minded. So I think that, we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but these are some of the things that we need to start really thinking about. Just getting back to the basics. How do we activate civically? Another thing that we do through our federation work and through our Jewish Public Affairs Committee is we bring together legislators, from the Jewish caucus and Latino caucuses, and really try to look at how can we support the policies that benefit one another's communities. So I think there's really an opportunity for some innovative policymaking especially as we head into this, sort of, election cycle over the next several months, and really get out there and lean in civically.
That's absolutely right, Mary. And what I will say is, just as a reminder for our audience, both the museum and the Federation are nonprofit and nonpartisan organizations. And Mary is exactly right. Demographically and politically, both the Latino and the Jewish community do tend to lean significantly to the left. And we've done past programs on that in the past. Mm-hmm. But through all of our organizations, whether you happen to be left, right, or center, I think Mary's core point is the importance of getting involved on behalf of these issues. Because even while people of different parties and different ideologies might have different ideas of how to get to those solutions, we can all agree on the importance of those common goals. And that's another building bridges conversation for probably another month. But in the meantime, Rosie, I'm wondering if I can ask you to go a little bit deeper than Mary was just able to in the limited amount of time that I allowed her. I'm wondering, particularly in this time of such economic anxiety, if you can talk a little bit more about those shared policy goals that Mary refers to which our communities can be, toward which our communities can be working together.
Sure. No, thank you, Dan. I think, as everyone has been highlighting this critical moment in time we're living in, and what we're seeing with the pandemic, I mean, we've seen, just going back to these historic investments, both from federal government, local government, philanthropic resources, and a lot of conversations around how we advance a much more bold vision for our future in a stronger economic state. And so, I think this is the opportunity for us to really think about how do we advance a shared economic social justice agenda that really also looks at a broader narrative about multiracial coalition building. We all know that if we're stronger together as a community, and the well-being of our region, our state, and our country is really linked to how well we all do. And when we look at Los Angeles and Latinos representing close to 50% of the LA County population, but yet faring, at the very bottom in terms of, like, when we look at access to higher education, to access to healthcare, they're still at the bottom. And so if we know that we need to support each other to have a stronger economic future for our region, that we need to work together, because it is in our best interest to do that. And that's also going to require looking at more intergenerational strategies. We know we have a very young population in our community. Also here in Los Angeles, a very young population, both Latinos and multi-ethnic. And so I think that the future is bright. Our communities are very optimistic also about the future, despite the challenges we face. And it is a moment in time where people are also talking about, inclusion, but also how do we work together to advance a collective vision and more coordinated strategies. So one example is, we know right now LA County, through the American Rescue Plan dollars, just recently allocated close to $1 billion in resources, all focused on economic recovery. And so the county is going through a budgeting process where they're looking at phase 2 of implementation of those resources. So how are we ensuring that we are looking after the best interests of all of our communities? Because when one community moves forward, we all move forward together. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in this time, especially as institutions and different sectors are talking about how do we reimagine and think of a much stronger and brighter future that really is inclusive of all communities, regardless of background.
So Rosie, I want to follow up on that with you in just a moment, but I also want to take a moment first to let our audience know that, first of all, for those of you who posted in the chat, we really appreciate your thoughts. But if any of you have questions that you'd like me to put to our panelists, as you can see at the bottom of your screen, a few icons to the right of the chat function is the Q&A function. So please feel free to enter a question under the Q&A, and I'll do my best to ask your questions before our hour together runs out. But Rosie, I want to come right back to you and ask you to follow up on this, because one of the things I've always loved hearing you talk about, for as long as we've known each other, is you talk about the first of the first. And each of the panelists has talked about this commonalities between our communities. But the first time I heard you talk about it to a Latino audience, I thought to myself, well, my father was the first person in his family, in our family, to go to college. And so that opportunity and that burden that comes with being the first of the first is one more thing that two different communities with two different types of immigrant experiences can share. And particularly in this time of economic distress, particularly given the educational challenges that Villaraigosa talks about, can you talk a little bit more about that concept of the first and what that means to a family, particularly in challenging economic circumstances?
Yeah, no, thank you, Dan. Well, I think, as we're seeing in our communities over the years, over the last 2 decades, there's been a lot of just great infrastructure to, we're seeing stronger nonprofit organizations that are serving communities and really, looking at opportunities to strengthen, deepen our civic engagement and in the community. But, at the same time, as our communities are well established, right? They have a long history. We just heard this history of many of our families that have been here for many decades. But yet, in terms of when we look at our ability to, move up the economic ladder and have access to higher educational opportunities, many of us are still the first in our families to achieve that 4-year degree, to be able the first to, open a business. And so I feel that, when we think of collaboration, one of the things that we also opportunities to see is how do we support each other, not just by providing mentorship, but how do we also sponsor each other to ensure that we are accelerating that growth and change in our communities. Because, I can just share personally, I'm the daughter of immigrant parents. I'm one of 10 kids my parents had, and many of my sisters the first to go to college, and we're learning as we go and supporting each other as a family. My parents are also getting older, and so as we're moving up, we're bringing entire families with us together. And so I feel that we have a tremendous opportunity right now in this time where we have the tools, we have that blueprint for social and economic justice. And for me, I think this opportunity really calls on all of us is how are we leveraging our influence and our power and our resources to help accelerate that social change in the community?
Well, I think that's exactly right. For those of you who've joined our programs before, you may have heard me previously cite one of my favorite quotes from the late American humorist Mark Twain, who used to like to say, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And so two different types of immigrant experiences, two different types of first of the firsts, two different paths for moving forward that really, as each of you have said in different ways, really have a lot more in common than they have differences. Mayor Villaraigosa talked a little bit earlier about the importance of education. And I think his point, and I would agree with it wholeheartedly, is all of us need to learn more. All of us need to become more aware. But I know that you and your colleagues at the Federation have spent a particular amount of time thinking about making that knowledge available to young people, so our next generation of leaders can grow up with an understanding of the importance of moving forward together. Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing and what can be done to get young people involved in understanding the importance of this path forward? Well, we've got Mary muted. There you go.
I think we really do have an opportunity with young adults to forge a more unified path toward the outcomes we've talked about. I think our younger generation has and is flexing a muscle that some of us are catching up to. I think they have been raised with values and in a way, sort of as citizens of the world. And they have, they want to see a better world. They see crisis in their day-to-day. So I think we want to sort of funnel that energy. We want to give them skills and knowledge, but also exposure to other communities and cultures and histories. So, as you said, history rhymes. Like they can learn from the lessons of history and then see the commonalities and the differences, and then also just develop relationships for themselves. So one of our signature programs, actually Jordana did the program And Susan's daughter, Anita, did the program, is our Rauchenberg New Leaders Project, where we bring together emerging Jewish civic leaders and we expose them to different communities throughout Los Angeles and teach them about the various issues in our city. So everything from learning about people experiencing homelessness to how do we combat hate? What do we do about the climate? What about education in Los Angeles and LAUSD? And what we're also doing now through our civic partnerships programs is we're bringing our young adults together with young adults at other communities. We recently did a program with the Holocaust Museum and an organization called Cause, where we had our leaders view the Jews of Shanghai exhibit together and talk about kind of our histories as Asian Americans and as Jewish people. And we're taking our young leaders tonight to an organization called Heart of Los Angeles, which serves underprivileged kids in various ways through a lot of scholarship, through mentorship programs for youth, and really as a support to families. So I'm really optimistic. I just want to share one last I think probably one of the most compelling things from the study that I referenced earlier that came up is, and this was a study, which determined that we have almost 570,000 Jews in Los Angeles. And among these 570,000 Jews, 52% said that working for justice and equality in society was an essential part of being Jewish. And then I'm getting chills, another 36% said it was an important part of being Jewish. So it ranks among the top 3 things that our community believes is essential and important about being Jewish. So, I mean, that's almost, 90% of our community members believe that we should be working for justice and equality in society. So let's channel that, let's vision together, let's do the work, and the little things. I think, again, it's not rocket science. It's about bringing our people together and learning about each other and caring about each other, making some sacrifices for the greater good.
Well, yeah, so many important points there, Mary. And for those of you who didn't see, Jordana just reposted the Federation study there in the chat box, and I'd strongly encourage you to take a look at it because it's fascinating findings. But one of the things that really struck me from what you were just saying, Mary, is the little things. Yeah, changing the world can seem like a pretty daunting, intimidating thing to take on. And if each person just does a little bit, well, then that adds up to changing the world. And Susan, that brings me back to you. It'd be really easy for a cynic to say, tacos and challah, well, that's really neat, but what does that have to do with making real change? Can you talk a little bit about how those little things that Mary mentioned, how those little things can add up to big things? Now we've put you back on mute again. Susan?
I think that, I go back to what the mayor was saying and Mary and everybody, that education is the key. It's the key to understanding each other. And you have to start that with young people. You have to start it. You have to bring it in. You have to bring them in. And I keep visualizing when I make challah on Fridays, you have to have minimum 3 strands, but you can have a 4-strand challah, a 6-strand challah. Let's merge our communities the way we merge the strands of the challah. It's miraculous. And, I just think that there is a place where we can influence young Latinos, young Jews to get to know each other, to love each other, to appreciate each other's cultures. And I'm here. I'll help. That's what I can say. But let's start with young people and trying to promote what is good in our cultures to each other. And let's get rid of the division and the hate and come together with the things that we have in common.
I think it's just such an important reminder, Susan, for those of us who spend too much of our time in politics over the years. We tend to forget that most people, particularly young people, see politics as something very foreboding and very intimidating. And so if it starts with tacos, if it starts with challah, if it starts with dancing, if it starts with music, and then builds up to a stronger community relationship, then maybe that's a way to bring in a much broader portion of the community than those who just want to be strictly political.
Yes.
Um,
And it's also a way to get away from the politics.
exactly.
Just be human. Just be human. We all have that in common. So
And each one of you have made that point in slightly different ways. And I think that brings me back to Mayor Villaraigosa, who started this conversation and can hopefully help us wrap it up. And Mayor Villaraigosa, I'll ask you, given everything we've covered tonight, what else should we be thinking about in terms of this outreach, in terms of this build bridging, for someone who's devoted his career and his life to this? What guidance would you give to the rest of us about what we should be thinking about as we move forward?
Again, I don't think any community does it as well as part of their everyday experience as the Jewish community does. But, you know, I was thinking of Tzedek a few minutes ago, and a Jewish founded organization that, you know, the vast majority of tenants are non-Jews. A good percentage are Latinos. I think given some of the resources of, you know, organizations like the Federation and others, I mentioned sitting on boards. I think that's important. You know, that can be helpful. You know, boards fundraise, boards, have relationships with, you know, business leaders and community leaders. And I think, Latino organizations can benefit from that kind of participation. I mentioned education. I think already groups like the Federation, the ADL, and others, AJC, identify young leaders, political leaders, send them, they invite them to Israel. I think you could do that, not just invite them to Israel, but invite them on projects of common ground. Doing what you're doing now, I think is really important, and I'm impressed by the comments of all of the people here. But I think ultimately, it's work that brings people together. It's important to have these conversations, but we're oftentimes talking ourselves. Let's be honest. People like-minded who care about reaching out to other groups. I've been doing that. I mean, I wouldn't have been mayor if there wasn't a Jewish community. I joke when Los Angeles Magazine said after a bit of a crisis that I was going through, they called me failure. 2 weeks later, the Jewish Journal did a front cover where they said success. This is a community that I've been very close to for a very, very long time, but I'm also close to the African American community. I've been introduced in some places as the second African American mayor. I worked that community because I knew it was an important community in this town, and I would suggest that the organizations like the Holocaust Museum should be working with other Jewish organizations that are interested in reaching out this way, inviting people to your boards, participating in the boards of others, making investments. As I said, Tzedek doesn't just, it's a largely Jewish funded organization, but the people that they help are disproportionately from other groups. I think that's a model for other Jewish groups to kind of build those relationships. I think conversations like this, Susan mentioned halal and tacos. I think efforts like this to bring people together are really, really important. And I'm going to stay on education, scholarships in those communities. We are in a crisis in this town with the level of poverty we have. And it's some of why we have the level of homelessness that we do, the level of poverty that we do. We have got to make investments in in the Latino community and other communities, but by far, they're the largest part of this town, and they're the biggest part of the poverty of this town. So making those concrete investments, I think, are important. Building youthful leadership, I think that Mary was talking about, I think really, really important. Starting people off now about our commonalities, curricula. The ADL does some of that. Their anti-hate efforts are not just focused on Jews, they're focused on everyone. I think we all have to do a better job of that. I'm putting together a group of Jewish organizations around the candidacy of one of the people running for mayor. And one of the things I mentioned to them, what they mentioned, they're looking for, a mayor that's going to be present when there's a hate crime in the Jewish community. I never missed an opportunity to be there with them, but not just with them, with Muslims as well, with every group in this town. And I think we all need to kind of teach our children about the importance of reaching out, the importance of identifying common ground, the importance of doing tzedakah and, tikkun olam and making efforts to do mitzvah. And so from my vantage point, I want to thank you for allowing me to participate. Sorry, I'm sitting here. The stand here wasn't working and I'm playing with it the whole time and I just let it go. But so I want to thank you all for inviting me in. And I want to end with me. So I'll shoot it to you, Dan.
Well, thank you very much. And I know somewhere Herman Katz would be very, very happy to hear your thoughts, to hear the thoughts you've been sharing with all of us. I also want to mention before—
It's a big reason why I'm here today, I'll tell you.
Okay. Well, before I thank everyone else, I do want to mention that in the chat box, we've seen a number of really worthwhile organizations post their information. Fuente Latina, Camp Bob Waldorf, Jewish Big Brothers and Sisters, and Janet and Bertha and the others. I'll tell you that Jordana and I will make sure that your contact information is forwarded to all of our panelists. So if there are ways that any of us can be helpful to you going forward, what you're doing in these communities is exactly what we've been talking about here today. So thank you for all the good work that you do. Thanks again to the Honorable Antonia Villaraigosa, to Mary Kohav, to Rosie Arroyo, and to Susan Schmidt for volunteering your time and sharing your very valuable insights. Thanks to the entire team at the Holocaust Museum of Los Angeles. Thank you, Paulette, for being with us tonight and all the great work you do for the museum. But Beth Keen, Guy Lipa, the entire team, and especially Jordana Gessler, the unsung hero of our organization, who makes countless events like these happen, both online and in the real space every day. For those of you who, and thanks especially to those of you who watched us tonight online for this very inspiring conversation. As I mentioned earlier, Building Bridges is a monthly series, so we hope you'll join us again soon. Our September program, we're taking August off, will focus on Jewish-Catholic relations in a post-Holocaust world. We also hope you'll visit our website that Jordana posted at holocaustmuseumla.org for a full calendar of upcoming in-person and online programs, including weekly Holocaust survivor talks and our virtual summer Holocaust Remembrance film series, which starts next week. And if you like, you can also watch past programs on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/HolocaustMuseumLA. And a recording of tonight's program will be posted online if you'd like to share it with friends or family or colleagues. Thanks again to our panel. Thanks again to the entire team at the museum. Thanks again, most of all, to our audience for joining us tonight. Hope you all have a wonderful evening, and we'll look forward to seeing you again for future programs.
Thank you.